All right, so since the kidney's job is to filter blood and remove waste, and then it removes that waste by creating urine, essentially, you have to understand the blood supply of the kidney and the nephron so that you understand how blood enters the kidney, is filtered, and then exits out of the kidney. Okay. So I'm just going to draw on here where the blood vessels are and label those blood vessels. And then I might actually, I'm going to go backwards to this chart and add some of my blood vessels. And then I'm maybe going to make a flow chart. We'll see. Remember, it's like 15-minute video. So we'll see. Okay. So the first thing you want to understand is you want to remember that you have the abdominal aorta here, right? And that the renal artery, and actually I'm going to make that in black. The renal artery is going to come off of the abdominal aorta. So the abdominal aorta is coming off of the left ventricle. And when it comes off the left ventricle, it's going to bring things like oxygen, nutrients, and it's also going to contain waste. Basically, blood is going to be filled with like everything pretty much all of the time. Okay. Why does it contain waste? Because remember, veins are going to pick up that waste from body cells. It gets transported from the inferior vena cava into the right side of the heart, goes to the lungs, where you're going to exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen. So once you pick up oxygen, now you have to deliver that oxygen-rich, nutrient-rich blood around the body. So it still contains waste. It's going to contain waste until it gets filtered through the kidney. So that nutrient and waste-filled blood goes from the abdominal aorta into the renal artery, which is actually going to be the deeper blood vessel. So you should see the renal vein on top of the renal artery. And then as soon as the renal artery comes into the hilum area, right where the renal pelvis is, it's going to branch. So you see how we have 1, 2, like 3 branches. So those branches are going to be the segmental arteries. And I'm just going to draw like what happens to one segmental artery. So the segmental artery is going to continue, and it's going to have branches that go between the renal pyramids. Remember, those are the renal pyramids. Then it's going to arc up over the renal pyramids, essentially. Okay. And I know this is going to be weird, but it flows back down. Why? Because mostly the segmental artery has to branch into the next set of artery, essentially. Okay. So you might have like multiple branches kind of coming off and coming and looping around like that. Coming off of the artery that arcs, you're going to have smaller arteries that radiate up into the cortex. So kind of like making eyelashes on top of the renal pyramids. So it'd be like that, essentially. All right. So I'm going to go through here and label all of these blood vessels. So we have the renal artery, and then it branches to become the segmental artery. The segmental artery you should find in the renal pelvic area. So kind of where the hilum is into the renal pelvis. And then once you are inside of the renal medulla between the pyramids, this becomes the interlobar. Let me rewrite that. So inter means between, and lobar means lobe. All right. So I didn't really teach you guys this, but basically every pyramid and column is one lobe of the kidney. So the kidney has, I think, something like 7 or 8 different lobes, something like that. So like interlobar, the interlobar arteries go in between the pyramids in the renal columns, excuse me. And then once it arcs over, so like that part plus that part, it becomes the arcuate artery. So the arcuate artery should be between the cortex and the renal medulla, or really on top of the renal pyramid. Then these guys that are small, the smaller ones, so maybe we'll label these smaller ones here. These are called the cortical radiate arteries because they radiate into the cortex. Basically, they fan out into the cortex. Okay. And then what you have to do is you have to draw a nephron so that you understand what's coming off of the cortical radiate artery. So you understand how these arteries are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So I'm just going to draw a very simplistic nephron. Sorry, I was thinking, do I want to, how do I want to do this? This is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna draw the top of my renal pyramid like that so that you can kind of follow this along. So basically we would have our interlobar artery and then our arcuate curves up over like that. And then we're gonna have our cortical radiate arteries, okay? So the cortical radiate arteries are gonna have a small arterial, but it's going to be a little bit wider, this arterial that's going to come off, and it feeds into a capillary system. Then it exits out of that capillary system, and it's going to be another arterial. Okay, and this is going to be the supply to the nephron. So essentially what you can do is draw your glomerular capsule around that, and then your proximal convoluted tubule, if you want to, draw your nephron loop and then come back up to your distal convoluted tubule. If you have your other drawings from before, you can also just use those other drawings, okay? And then I'm just going to put my collecting duct kind of like that. So if this is my cortical radiate artery, then I'm going to label this one that comes off first. That's the afferent arterial. It should be bigger, okay? So I told everybody it has a wider lumen. It's the bigger blood vessel. Sometimes the lumen doesn't look so wide, but it will have thicker walls. And then the capillary system that's inside of the glomerular capsule, remember that's the glomerulus. This is a capillary. And then that capillary feeds out to the efferent arteriole. So both the afferent arteriole, the glomerulus and the efferent arteriole, those should always be in the cortex, unless, of course, you're a nephron that's in the renal column. So forgot to tell you that you can actually have some nephrons in the renal column as well, but it's the same glandular tissue, essentially. Then what's going to happen is the efferent arteriole is going to become another capillary. And that capillary is going to circle around the proximal and the distal convoluted tubule. And when it does, it's eventually going to drain into, can actually drain into a couple places, but to make our lives easier, I'm just going to say that it drains into one place, and that is the cortical radiate vein. Okay, so then you're just going to kind of create your vein coming all the way back down. Because remember, veins and arteries parallel one another, all right? Now, if this is a juxtamedullary nephron with a really long nephron loop, this is where our peritubular capillary is going to become the vasa recta. So on the other picture, I'm going to draw the difference between those two things. I'm just going to finish labeling this picture here. So this is my peritubular capillary. This capillary is highly permeable to all substances, so things can move back and forth between the filtrate and the blood. So all that's the peritubular capillary that's eventually going to drain into the cortical radiate vein, and then that drains into the arcuate vein, okay? So essentially you can come in here and you can start to just draw the parallels so that you understand, yes, there's a parallel vein all the way down until you reach the renal vein right there. Okay, so yeah, there will be branches that are going to come down like that. all the way down. So we're going to label these two so that you understand that there is a slight difference between the arteries and the veins, essentially, right? So the arcuate vein is actually going to become the interlobar vein. So basically you drain from the arcuate vein into the interlobar vein. So here we have our arcuate artery, we have our arcuate vein, like that. And then where we have our interlobar artery, we would essentially have an interlobar vein as well. So we could just continue drawing a vein right there. So you could label that one, but I'm just going to label this one over here. I'm going to say that's the arcuate vein. I'm going to also say this is the arcuate vein. And then we have our interlobar vein. Now here's where it becomes different. So the interlobar vein actually continues all the way down from the renal columns through the renal pelvic area, and actually all of the interlobar veins, so that's also an interlobar vein right there, drain into the renal vein. Okay, you don't have the renal vein until the outer part of the hilum. So if that's the hilum right there, you're going to see how the segmental artery branches. There is no segmental vein though. So that means right until the base of the renal vein, you're going to have interlobar veins. And then, of course, the renal vein drains into the inferior vena cava. I'm just going to abbreviate IVC. You guys shouldn't abbreviate, okay? You should write out inferior vena cava. So what's happening is blood's going to enter the afferent arteriole. It enters the glomerulus, and when it does, the glomerulus has holes, so some contents of blood leave or are filtered, and then blood continues to flow out of the efferent arteriole through the peritubular capillary, okay? So you basically lost the waste because you filtered it out. And then as you exchange things back and forth between the nephron and the peritubular capillary, it changes the contents of the filtrated contents of blood. But your blood is going to then exit out into veins. So basically the vein should now contain things like carbon dioxide. And I know you're wondering, how's that possible? Well, all these cells have to use the oxygen that are being brought in. So they're using the oxygen and the nutrients, and they're going to actually get rid of their own carbon dioxide and some of their own waste. But then you also want to think about what's remaining is maybe there's still some oxygen and nutrients. We don't want to get rid of all of our nutrients during filtration. So we have to pick up all our nutrients again during the formation of the filtrate, and those have to exit out of the inferior vena cava and go back to the right side of the heart. This is why circulation is actually pretty weird concept. It's not the best. It's not as easy as you think in terms of like this happens all the time in arteries and this happens all the time in veins. Arteries and veins are going to be holding lots of different things all over the body at different times, okay? So let's go back here so you can see a little bit of the difference between the cortical nephron and the juxtamedullary nephron. So again, like you would basically have a cortical radiate artery, like right here. Your efferent arteriole would come in, you'd create your glomerulus. Sorry, your afferent arteriole will come in, your efferent arteriole will come out. So that's actually the same for both cortical and juxtamedullary nephrons. There's no difference there between those two things, okay? Remember, the afferent one, you should draw a little bit thicker and wider, whereas the efferent one, you want it to be a little bit thinner. They're both going to have a peritubular capillary, so that goes around. So it starts at the efferent arteriole, and it basically wraps around the proximal convoluted tubule and the distal convoluted tubule. And then it drains into the cortical radiate vein right there. It's going to drain into the cortical radiate vein, all right? So the one difference that you're going to see is that the juxtamedullary nephron, because it has such a long nephron loop, it actually has another capillary system that surrounds that nephron loop, and that's called the vasa recta or vasa recta. So I'm going to say paratubular capillary here. So again, over here we have the paratubular capillary. I'm just going to abbreviate it as the PC for now, okay? Don't use abbreviations. I probably won't remember what PC means. So you see, that's another difference that you can write down, but there's also another thing that they both have in common. They both have a paratubular capillary. It's just that the juxtamedullary nephron has a vasa recta, whereas cortical nephrons do not. And the vasa recta is necessary because it's going to help us with exchanging some of the solutes that get moved out of the nephron loop, okay? So what I want you guys to do is I want you to think about being able to draw your own flow chart. You don't have to use the one that's in the PowerPoint. You can really do it in any way that you want to. I mean, you can basically start with like renal artery and then go the next one, the next one, the next one. Like maybe you want to do all the way to like your nephron. Whoops. Might as well just kind of go through this, right? So the renal artery becomes the segmental artery, branches into segmental arteries, and then interlobar arteries. And then the interlobar artery becomes the arcuate. I'm just going to switch my picture like right there. And then if you're really good, you might want to write down like where you would find this in association with the kidney so that you understand that. Sometimes that makes good multiple choice questions. So the arcuate becomes the cortical radiate. Excuse me, wrote that wrong. The cortical radiate artery branches into the afferent arterial, which branches into the glomerulus, which branches into the efferent arterial, that is then going to become the paratubular capillary, and the vasa recta. But remember, the vasa recta is only in juxtamedullary nephrons. And then essentially what you should see is that becomes the cortical radiate vein. I'm just going to abbreviate, but you guys write it out, okay? Into the arcuate vein, which becomes interlobar. Vein, which becomes the renal vein, right? So you notice how there's no segmental vein here. And then what you might want to again think about is where do you find the interlobar vein? Is it the same place you find the interlobar artery? Yes and no, because the interlobar vein is going to be found in the renal columns, but also extending all the way to the renal pelvis. Okay, so think about that. Sounds like a good test question, maybe, to see if you understand. And then remember, all that is at the nephron. Actually, let me redo this here. Actually, all of that is at the nephron. So see, you probably can make your chart a little bit better so that your nephron is in place. The one in the PowerPoint's really nice, but sometimes it's not that easy to remember that chart. Okay, this is like create your own charts. You'll remember stuff that you create better than something that you just stared at on a YouTube video.